Is that lady still? Pretty sure something will happen.
Push the desk forward. It might be the easiest thing to do to avoid.
Even then.
Yeah, it's not going to win very well. Just before we start, anything teams need to know about the cameras or everything dealt with? Okay, wonderful. Okay, welcome everyone to the first round of Quotas 2017. Speeches are 7 minutes in length with the first and last minute protected. They will be banned after 1 minute, at which point points of information can be offered, and banned after 6 minutes, at which point points of information can no longer be offered, and a double knock at 7 minutes, at which point please bring your speeches to a close. After about 7:15, we will stop listening, so there is no advantage talking longer. Any questions? Great, I'd like to call upon the first speaker to open the case for the government.
Ready? It's absolutely disgusting that later today I'll be going to watch a Liverpool match, but never in my life have I saw a Malaysian local sport. But that is what colonizers were able to do. So this debate needs to appreciate the specific nuances of what colonizers were able to do. They were able to suggest that they were the apex of human societies, and it's very unfortunate, but many people bought into these sort of characterizations and still do till today. Because unfortunately, we live in a world where the 1975, a very shitty boy band, is somehow better than Alicat, a local Malaysian group. And we think that world needs to change. So neo-colonization through soft power is what we incredibly regret. Some model, we would, as far as possible, limit all sorts of colonizer-based media. This includes movies, artwork, literature, whatever have you. We will not read The Great Gatsby. We will ask a Malaysian author to tell us some nice story about the girl he loved, and we would prefer that world because that would involve stuff like Nasi Lemak, and the lady won't be called Daisy, right? So, but more importantly than that, we'll be able to prove to you two important things. Number one, if the British or the colonizers, I'm so sorry, not only the British colonizers, right? But if the colonizers are able to continue to garner money because of things that they were able to suggest from the start and continue to benefit off of that, we think that is as bad as still colonizing us, and we need repatriation, we need money back, not to give money to them. But secondly, if they were also able, and if they're still able to put in certain cultural norms that are unfortunate, like whitewashing and the fetishization of white skin, we think if limiting that makes our people feel generally better, we are better off. Those are the two key burdens OG takes in this debate. First burden, the assumption of credibility. It is unfortunate, but in most colonized states, it is conceived that speaking English is one that's considered intelligent. That playing chess is more important than playing a local sport. And these sort of narratives were entrenched when the British came here because they were your military generals, they were the leaders, they were the people that knew what to do when, and they sometimes even suggested that they were protectors from the Japanese invasion and they won the wars, right? We think that sort of narrative is extremely harmful. Why so? Because oftentimes this has enabled them to continue to benefit off of these narratives set upon the nations that they colonize. And why? These are three structural reasons that oftentimes colonizing parties still are able to benefit. Number one, they have lots more money to make. Like bands like Muse and Coldplay have huge amounts of outreach to numerous different countries. Hence, they continue growing in money. And what this money oftentimes are able to make them do is make live shows in different countries, are able to buy huge TV networks, are able to buy magazines and have authors write very good stuff about them. We find that problematic because no way in the foreseeable future will a colonized state ever have the power, outreach, or money. Because it is not bad enough that they stole money from us from the past. Like India still hasn't got their crown jewel back, and that's disgusting. Sit down. But like we think to continue having money from these people is ludicrous. And unfortunately, states are in the specific interest and have these specific ambits to limit this. How will they do this? Because obviously people like watching TV and people like subscribing to art on a national level. If they find it incredibly hard to access the Western or the colonized version of this art, they're oftentimes more likely to invest in their own form of art, right? And also we think this will lead to a snowballing effect, right? Because when you find these arts resonate stronger with you, they actually display local stories that you resonate stronger with, you're more likely to subscribe to these forms of art. The reason why they've never had an incentive to do so is because they continue subscribing to the colonizing art. So in a balance of probabilities, we are able to ensure that we do not lose all money to like individuals who go watch Muse when they come here, but they're more likely to subscribe to local artists, and we prefer that. But that is on a very small level. In the biggest of level, it is unfortunate, but the Malaysian government gives huge amounts of grants to people to go study in Oxford because Oxford is considered the apex of learning, and we find that absolutely disgusting. We prefer that money being reinvested in local universities to hire better lecturers or to improve the facilities provided here, because at every dollar that you give Oxford is a dollar that you give the British Empire that continues to subjugate its people even to today. But before I go on, yes?
So what do you think is the main structural cause for this neo-colonialism happening in general? Is it the state's investment?
So I told you three things, right? Number one, they came in and they said they were better than us. We believed them, unfortunately, because they had guns and we had spears. Secondly, they also got lots of money and they burnt our petroleum because they were afraid the Japanese were invading, right? So not only did they take our money, they made sure we weren't able to take our money. And with that money, they were able to go tell the whole wide world that their music, that their art, that their literature was a lot better. And people were unfortunately believing of that. And simultaneously, they were able to tell us that maybe our culture was not as important. And that is the structural reasons why the British Empire continues to grow till today. And that is unfortunate and disgusting. Secondly, what do these movies have that oftentimes on a singular individual level cause numerous problems, right? Oftentimes these movies are whitewashed, and oftentimes they fetishize the color of white. Why do we say this? We see oftentimes famous actresses that win numerous awards, oftentimes they get recasted, or often white individuals. Like, it is fortunate in the world that Lupita Nyong'o has won an award, but Emma Watson has gotten so much more credence, and Benedict Cumberbatch gets so much more fan support. The unfortunate thing is, the narrative that is now subjugated onto the people is that oftentimes the whiter you are, the more likely you are to succeed, because you're considered to be more favorable, you're considered to be better looking, and that's an unfortunate narrative. What does this do? If you look at countries like India, this has gone so bad that India has the biggest subscribers to whitening products, because people that inherently believe that being whiter is inherently better, that the whiter girl or the whiter guy is more likely to get a job interview or get the job, and we find that bad. Why are we able to change that? When you display more local color, when I watch TV and I no longer see a white man being the apex of a good look, but I see a brown man that resembles me, number one, that incredibly increases my self-esteem, but simultaneously that is me no longer subscribing to a culture that oppresses me, because no matter how hard I try, I can never achieve that. What are the burdens that OG fulfilled so far, and what are the burdens the OP needs to fulfill? Number one, understanding that this nature is about pre-colonized states or colonized states in general, we need some level of our culture being able to continue to grow, because we're still nascent in these stages. But secondly, but more importantly, we should not be shipping huge amounts of our money to a country that was only able to claim that they were successful because they took our money in the first place. But thirdly, and more importantly, we think we need to start displaying culture that is more sentimental and more resonates much higher with our people, because this reduces our necessity or our longingness to be more white. What does the OP need to prove? The OP can either do one of two things, right? They will either try to tell you that these harms will not continue, that globalization will oftentimes stem this. We think that those sort of responses is insufficient, because globalization at the same time ensures the British Empire or the Spanish Armada or the Americans continue to grow. For that, happy to propose.
Thank you very much for that explanation. I'd like to call on the first speaker for the opposition.
No. Okay. I think it's important to look at this debate as a debate about perception, because essentially films, music, and television are forms of perception pushed to the general public by the media. Now, a few rebuttals first. First, about their insistence on how Western media seemingly is the only source of counter-narrative, and their assertion that local forms of narratives can be regressive or are for the most part regressive. Now, first on their countermeasures. The problem in status quo, if progressiveness is what you're fighting for, such as acceptance of homosexual rights and the rights of other minorities, is that a lot of times these fights for progressiveness are viewed as forms of Western imposition. Or more often than not, these forms of fights are catered to Western liberal biases. Movements in feminism, such as Free the Nipple and other highly left-wing movements, are more often not incompatible with local cultural values. If progressiveness is what you are truly fighting for, we would rather Western media be severely limited and locals do it instead. We believe that locals are more likely to buy in when it's a local suggestion. When local people are pushing towards these things are more likely to be listened to due to the nature of the push for it, whereby it's in a local language. Also the credibility carried by these things. But it's not enough to just allow both mediums to push for it. There's a reason why we need to limit Western media specifically. Because of the limited amount of political capital that exists within each country, we need to then decide which fight we're going for. It's not enough for both of them to exist, because in the end you got two equally weak fights. We need a concentration of political capital. We need Western liberal movements to stop draining political capital from things such as cultural feminism. Now, in progressive ways, we don't believe locals are always regressive in their methods. As proven earlier, more often than not, locals also have their own unique forms of progressiveness. But more often than not, these things are uniquely tied to local progress. It means that you're more likely than not to follow the pace of these local countries rather than push for the pace of these liberal countries such as the UK. But why it's specifically harmful is that liberal media, more often than not, is paced way far ahead, further than what these local countries are ready for. It means that the amount of initial backlash is definitely going to be higher if you're going to push for these Western forms of media, pushing for these progressive values. We believe that it's important to pace progression to that is suitable to local people as a whole. POI.
So if current political scenes have already said any form of Western values is Western imposition, even if it's not true, doesn't limiting the access to it entrench that narrative even more?
We believe that what's important here is achievement of those progressive values. It's okay for things to be branded as Western imposition as long as we get these values reframed from a local perspective, meaning that feminism in society will be related to topics such as, for example, wearing the hijab as a form of feminism. Note that certain forms of feminism from the Western world are incompatible with that from non-Western society, such as wearing the hijab. For example, in France, wearing the hijab is more often viewed as a form of imposition upon women and how it limits their ability. But a lot of people from non-Western cultures view it as a form of liberation. The ability to wear the hijab represents the ability of a woman to connect with her religion, for example. Now, on something that they never engaged with was the whitewashing of Western culture. We believe that more often than not, you see, the problem with Western media as a whole is when talking about colonialism specifically, and this is relating it back to motion, the problem with Western media is more often you whitewash these things, but the inherent value of whitewashing is you often skirt over the kinds of atrocities that these Western countries have imposed upon these developing nations early in history. We believe that this is specifically harmful when you talk about things such as perceptions of history, for example. We shouldn't allow Western countries to dictate how history should be perceived or dominate the narrative, because more often these people will not highlight the kinds of systemic problems that they put in place within these developing worlds. For example, Malaysia was heavily robbed of its natural resources, and this significantly hindered its capacity to compete later on. The reason why a lot of these Western countries are developed as they are is because of that initial plundering of developing nations. This is a narrative that's more often not forgotten within Western media as a whole. We need these narratives to return for the sake of claiming reparations for these things, or remembering history for accuracy's sake. We believe that it's important to remember history as it is, and not something that is to be whitewashed. But also on cultural growth, we believe that there's a systemic problem with Western dominance of the media, because it's essentially Western dominance of culture as well. We believe that at the point at which Western culture becomes something that's extremely popular, it becomes something that locals can never truly subscribe to, which brings back a lot of arguments on assumptions of credibility. Like, what it means to be competent isn't necessarily what it means to be white. But we have a lot of Western media, such as Sherlock Holmes, for example, that highlight the image of a white man being a genius. You hurt indirectly the capacity of other people from distinct ethnicities to follow their own brands of genius. We believe that this is extremely problematic because it also limits people's capacities. These are things that people are not extremely conscious of in society. For example, discrimination in job interviews. We believe that the problem in society also is the perception of credibility or the perception of competence. More often it's linked to the image of a white male rather than people from these ethnicities, people that were once colonized. We believe that the presumption of competence in society is not limited or isn't counted effectively by meritocratic means as well. I believe that a lot of these meritocratic means are more often than not skewed towards white individuals. It's very easy to justify your choice with some qualification because of the diversity of CVs, right? Which is why meritocratic means alone will never be able to will never be able to limit the capacity of these people to be discriminatory in job interviews. Now, what have I talked about so far? I've talked about how it's incredibly important for history to remember what it is. I've talked about the importance of white washing being counted. I've talked about why it's not enough to just allow for both forms of media to be allowed in society, but it's important to limit Western cultures as well, because Western culture effectively limits the capacity for local culture to be forwarded within society. Due to the nature of things such as access to capital of Western media, as highlighted by first speaker, it means that Western media as a whole needs to stop being dominant within local cultures. With that, proud to propose.
Is it possible to hold time? The minutes are
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call upon the second speaker for the office.
4 things. First of all, problematic narratives. Second of all, empowering domestic cultures. Third of all, individual choices and benefits to individuals in terms of cultural capital. Fourth of all, impacts on social movements and politics. First, let's start with problematic narratives. The first thing is said from Gov is that there's a problem of whitewashing, to which we think there's a dichotomy that we need to consider here. Either we posit that these privileges and biases are entrenched, to which we say that fundamentally these arts and culture and films do not contribute largely to it. I'll explain that more on that later on. Or we say there's sufficient pressures to counter that. First problem, then, the idea that they are entrenched systems. Note, all the examples I gave about the existence of historical actions, economic injustices, the ability of the West to control textbooks, production of media and all that, still persist on their side. Our claim is not only to say that it doesn't do anything, because they might say, you're still taking away one means of the West to reinforce that privilege. Our claim is that the West can easily substitute through alternative means of reproducing this privilege, like the internet, like textbooks, like writing the academia, like journals, that recreate the same extent of privileges to the extent that your claim here that entrenchment exists so strongly. Either that is the case, or we say that organic ways to deal with this entrenchment. There are 4 organic methods we say exist. This deals directly with the stuff they say about crowding out and also lowering of credibility. 1, democratic incentives. Note, if you live in a society where the majority of people are constantly being told they're inferior, denied jobs, or that you're fundamentally worse off because you don't look in a certain way, chances are you're not going to be a very popular government, but also on the local constituency level, where your own economic and performance of your voters matters disproportionately more in local council elections and how local cultures negotiate and produce. These are the cases where you're likely to care a lot more about countering the biases of whitewashing, because chances are most of the people that vote for you or elect you would feel pissed off if it is indeed true that you're living in a whitewash society where only 1% get off at it. If that is because of structured economic disincentives and privileges, that is a structural problem. That's nothing to do with arts, culture, or media. Second response, people choose and opt for the forms of consumption, right? Because their claim almost is set in an entirely colonial setting, right? They want to say that you live in a colonial society where this is hegemonic culture and there's no other forms of culture. That's not true, because a lot of the local cultures and mainstream mass cultures are A, low cost. That means you can easily opt into it in the forms of not necessarily paying for expensive tickets or cinema or going to watch a local festival, because you don't need to pay a substantial amount of money to go to a village corner to listen to your elder talk about history, or to walk on the streets of, KL and witness the local culture being entrenched and embraced. What does that mean? That means it is not true that people can only choose to consume Western culture in that sense. Thirdly, nationalist narratives. Note, the incentive for governments often in these cases is to construct the West as the other. How do they do that? That means they actively, as per the status quo, subsidize domestic cultures and local cultures. Why is this more plausible than their claim, which is colonial or post-colonial states borrow from the colonial master states? It's because the politicians, the leaders, and the structures that come to power after the end of colonialism tend to be those that are fucking angry at colonialism. That means our counter-narrative is more plausible than what they say. Fourthly, we just think that it's true. If their claim is a lack of funding or crowding out of local producers, the solution is to subsidize them. Their strongest claim that CTMAP pushes, no, but people don't go to them in the first place because they care about the West so much. A, if they do care about the West so much, it's unclear why that's ever an illegitimate choice. But B, we think that there's sufficient incentive to lure them because the exposure you get to local producers, local arts, is just so much higher than you get to Western arts. That's why there's no need to limit Western art and status quo. The brief thing about a moral argument, we just think people have the right to choose where they spend the money. So if I want to spend money on Coldplay, there's nothing wrong intrinsically with that. Second point, domestic culture. So their claim is that, right now people don't invest enough in domestic culture. Bunny already told you our counterpart is invest more in that. But second of all, my point here is that the existence of more Western arts in the local market helps local culture in developing. 4 reasons why. 1, you create an active political incentive and pressure on the government to ensure that the quality of the arts is subsidized, or the quality of the cultures they're producing here is commensurate, if not better, than the quality of the West. The existence of the West as a competitor, therefore, forces you to elevate the quality of your own art, to make it more enduring and attractive. That has a spillover benefit that makes it more internationally viable. You can export it to other places and therefore make money out of it. Second of all, we also think there's an inspiration effect, right? Bunny talks about the idea of, techniques and all of these hard forms of skills that you can acquire. Moreover, it's important to note that when people watch and engage with Western media, it's not just the content they're engaging with, because they realize from the way they've been brought up and the backgrounds that they've been engaged with, fundamentally the content is problematic. But they acquire things like cinematography or the very ways in which the narrative is constructed in Western media in order to make their own local narratives and their local arts more palatable. But thirdly, we also think there's an organic incentive that limits the extent of problematic whitewashing that is good. Because the existence of domestic arts as a competitor forces international films and movie producers to also ensure they don't whitewash as much, because doing so would cause them to lose out a large chunk of the market they otherwise have in the third world. That means that fundamentally, that all the more incentive for domestic cultures to be reserved on our side as opposed to yours. Thirdly, individual benefits. Our claim here is that people should have the right to choose and opt for the method and means in which they derive entertainment. That is a prima facie right, just like how I should have the right to consume Jane Eyre, or I should have the right to consume Pride and Prejudice, as opposed to you forcing me to read Twilight, or whatever you're talking about. Or in China, they don't all have to read the fundamental communist little red book from Mao, because fundamentally people have the right to determine the method in which they gain entertainment. There are 3 concrete benefits that support this. 1, the ability to escape, because the ability to associate with a cultural context that is not the one which you're arbitrarily assigned and born into is an important right. There's no fundamental reason why just because I'm Chinese or Malay or an Indian, I ought to be forced into and confined within the culture in which I'm born, right? There's a prima facie right. I have the ability to engage with other cultures and opt into them. And to the extent that you make it substantially harder for poorer or less privileged people to do that, we think that's an injustice in and of itself. Go on.
If people have a right to choose, why are you then subsidizing, according to Bunny, a backward culture that is unnecessary?
Oh, look, the nuance here is that obviously the governments don't need to subsidize really backwards and regressive cultures, right? All we're saying here is that there are some bad cultures, some good cultures for both sides of things. We can say, and we can support a nuanced proposition that says we don't need to have the funding of purely bad culture. But even if that's indeed the case, that still fundamentally means that on our side, people have the choice to opt out of that bad culture, whilst on your side, there's no opting out possible at all. The second benefit you get is cultural capital. When you go to an interview and people ask you, what are your thoughts on The Great Gatsby? And you say, I don't really know. look, the reality is sad, it's tragic, and because of the entrenched privilege, used to say, there are these biases, and a lot of these biases come from the common referential norms in terms of at interviews, right? Your ability to demonstrate that in applications, in interviews, in job places, gives you the cultural capital that translates into economic capital, better wealth, more promotion within a workplace if you choose to migrate overseas. Thirdly, important medium for language learning. Arts, movies, and television are important ways for people to acquire the linguistic skills because they're easy to acquire, easy to associate with, easy to familiarize with, and for consuming and watching these arts, you gain the skills that allow you to get more economic capital in a, sadly or not, but increasingly globalized society. For all of these reasons, we think individuals should have the right to choose and consume the art where and should they choose to do so. For all of these reasons, proud to oppose today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call on the third speaker for the government.
Basically, O came out with two propositions. Firstly, that Western media is important to either A, bring progressive values into post-colonial states, and number two, co-option is necessary for the success of your local artists. And the second proposition, against all logic, local media, admittedly low budget, logistically inconvenient to consume, can survive in direct competition with big budget Hollywood, as long as the Malaysian government have billions of dollars lying around to fund the next Malaysian Transformers, the next Malaysian Avatar, because apparently we can survive in direct competition. We will be the first, most comparative team in this debate, took down their points, and we will show you the unique importance of this policy of quota and the vast amount of benefits in which you can flexibly adjust this policy to bring benefits to the local scene. And secondly, we'll also show you why exactly the harms of post-neocolonialism can be adequately reversed in our side. Before that, let us deal with a few extraneous rebuttals. Firstly, Brian says that there's a right to choose. Sure, there is always a right to choose, but this right to choose has to be balanced with representation of minority cultures, right? That is why we've always strived for minorities to be represented. That is why we condemn whitewashing. Because although people have the right to choose to become American, Japanese in the like your major in Ghost in the Shell, we think that you also, like, to a certain extent, when it crowds out local artists and local stories, that is when we have to step in to ensure that there's a balance. Which is why this motion states that you strictly limit, not completely prohibit, because we recognize that the local culture has been suffering from overcrowding. It is time we give them some room to breathe so that people can associate with heroes from their own cultures. Secondly, they said you have to connect better with employers. But it's interesting because those benefits in status quo only exist to individuals locally who has the privilege to opt into a Netflix account, right? We tell you, in a world where we strictly limit access to foreign culture across the board, your prospective employers are likely to connect with you based on local stories and lower their expectations of what to expect from local employees, because now they will know that you have only been exposed to local cultures and they will try to get to know you more as opposed to expect you to opt into their culture. Thirdly, medium for language instruction. Are you serious? We can have like English schools and all those things. Like, yeah, that's it, right? Now, firstly, we used to have progressive values in our world. We said, firstly, that's extremely offensive to suggest that we would be unenlightened savages who discriminate against each other, have no idea of what the concept of whitewashing is. We tell you the wish to be equal, the wish to be treated equally, and the wish to not be like misrepresented is inherent in every culture, which is why even in Malaysia itself, you have Muslim feminists who yearn for equality. We tell you that it's true. But secondly, sometimes Western cultures are the ones who are uniquely offensive and racist, right? You only need to look at Ghost in the Shell or American Sniper, right? Who paint all other cultures except the white culture as an unenlightened, unprogressive, until white men comes in to save the day. We tell you they don't give any unique form of nation that Western culture, however progressive they may be, to bring towards local culture. But thirdly, also progressive value. When they as them as agent. That's why even though this is always like right now, there's happening time and time because my first media, the second
dominant Western feminists. But second, let's say, but what about corruption, right? Apparently, yes, what is inspiration for British. But we tell you it's incredibly marginal, and the trade-off is not worth it. Because we tell you we also have a lot of votes, right? Soon, like loud, right? Yeah, always because of those dominance of Western philosophers. If some kinds of inspiration is a trade-off that we not make in order to give more prominence to local philosophers who would take that trade-off any day. But secondly, the set what you call collaboration, right? Maybe sometimes it's unite and usher work together. We show your career is so important. But the point is, if they do bring benefit to local culture, it is our prerogative to allow those into the local scene, especially when they bring a lot of benefits locally, right? But what's the catch here? In which world do foreign studios have more incentives to give better representation to our local artists? It is a world where we have leverage to say, to tell you, if you don't include those things, it is when you're fall within the quota, we will not give you any exemptions. We tell that incentive structure exists more in our world. Ryan.
Whitewashing has been parodied, mocked, ridiculed, and critiqued extensively in a lot of developing countries, precisely because the majority of the people living there do not buy into the ridiculous narratives there. That means that the offense, even if it is...
That's what you say, but you still have the Great Wall, you still have Ghost in the Shell, you still have a myriad of, so many forms of whitewashing that still happens. We tell you it is a problem that will always exist. The only time when whitewashing will not be given prominence is when the locals produce it from the local pool of talent. Firstly, right, what is the importance of this quota? OG said the quota system, and we admit that that's correct, right? But what's the significance of those quotas? We tell you uniquely, it gives the local government leverage over foreign filmmakers, right? Like what China is doing. China, through their quota, they only give special privileges to film studios who's willing to, number one, profit share, right? It means that they're willing to share the profits they make locally with the local government so they can use that money to subsidize local filmmakers. If all wants to stay for subsidy, our world will ensure more money for that subsidy. Secondly, China also give priority to movies with low representation of local heroes, like Shanghai Nights, Shanghai Noon, which put Jackie Chan as one of the main characters in that movie itself, alongside Owen Wilson, right? You have things like Iron Man, right? Where they do have very prominent Chinese scientists in those movies who do help to forward the plot of those movies. Only in our world do you give incentive structures for filmmakers to cater towards the local industry. But secondly, why is it mutually exclusive to status quo, right? Look, there's two things that you have to recognize in the context of developing countries. Number one, your consumers have a limited amount of time and money to spend on entertainment, right? Secondly, not all film industries start off equal. Hollywood have decades of prominence and decades of headway ahead of them, whereas your local filmmaking industry are just infant industries, right? Which is why it is true when Brian say it's often low budget. It is true when Brian say it's not always available. You have to travel long distances to be able to enjoy those things, right? Which is why in the world where they're in direct competition with each other, local industries can never thrive exactly because people would rather use their money to opt for a more conveniently available big budget movie studios that is going to offer better entertainment to them. It is only in our world where we limit those big budget movies from overseas. Can people adjust their expectations? Will people finally be able to look at a Malaysian show and say it is no less inferior because they don't have a comparative to compare it to, where it is the only thing that they have to consume? That is when our local industries can strive. Panel for better representation, to give leverage to our government to improve our culture and representation. Go for CG.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call upon the third speaker for the opposition.
QIUP, man, is a Malaysian superhero film, and everyone commonly agrees that it's a terrible movie. But I want you to ask yourself one thing. Just imagine how terrible it would have been if the directors didn't have Spider-Man as a benchmark. Ladies and gentlemen, understand a few things, right? Sure, like we are benefiting from that. We are allowing our cultures to improve and benefit from theirs. But for a long time, right, colonizers have benefited from our countries. I think it's only fair that we benefit from theirs right now, right? So a few things. Firstly, like the opening debate was like, appreciation of local arts and how American movies can mitigate Malaysian racism. And like, I think this is a very selective case which may or may not materialize to anything useful. I'm going to enter this debate by telling you two things. Firstly, we'll tell you exactly how anti-colonial rhetorics, especially in these states, is an extremely dangerous thing. We can't allow governments this leverage, especially in the form of censorship, so on and so forth. Secondly, I'll talk about how this impacts the local culture, extending beyond what opening has talked about. Firstly, how anti-colonial steps will always affect like these colonial states, right? So firstly, these steps to restrict Western influence in these particular circumstances is always bad. Why? Because firstly, censorship. Censorship in and of itself is an extremely detrimental thing in this particular circumstance, irrespective of whatever they're trying to propagate here. Because like first things, right? Like obviously you're limiting the freedom of individuals' choice. I think opening has already talked about that. The problem here that we're going to talk about here in this particular circumstance is that the anti-West thing being used as a benchmark to restrict anything from coming into the country is extremely dangerous. Why? Because this is an extremely tedious, slippery slope that could possibly result as a form of this. Because once government have the ability to censor literally anything that they want or they would deem against local culture, this is a very easy thing for governments to use and abuse to like censor things that are also local, right? Because given that Western values is an extremely broad thing, right? It's very difficult to limit it down to just one particular thing. It's about individuality, it's about freedom, it's about love, compassion, many things. So obviously, like at some point in time, you're gonna have your local artists, your local like activists, your local people within your country that might fight for some particular form of change or might voice out for something. It's very easy for the government to deem that West as well, right? And use their power in this circumstance to also censor their voices. So especially when their case is heavily premised on how these people can necessarily evolve and these cultures can necessarily continue, we think that the point in time governments are given this special ability. It's very easy for them to subjugate so many people to censorship, given that it's so like the term West in and of itself is an extremely broad thing. But secondly, it creates a ghost villain, and this is an extremely bad thing because government, like this whole us versus them mentality can necessarily materialize in this particular circumstance. But why is that especially bad? Because given that now in post-colonial states, right, it's very like if you know what's going on, it's very like obvious that a lot of these problems do not have to do with colonialism, right? We're talking about corruption, we're talking about bad governments, things like famine. A lot of other factors are affect these countries in the way their politics work out today. But the problem in this particular circumstance is that the point in which governments are able to use this powerful mechanism, they can use it easily to escape accountability for specific actions, right? For example, it's very easy for politicians in India to simply say that, look, the reason in which like you're not having economic developments in these parts or that part is literally because like say the West had robbed us a long time ago, right? Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is an extremely stupid thing in this circumstance because obviously we know things like corruption, bribery. There's so much going on within the Indian government that could necessarily be escaped at the point in which they have this leverage, and they're going to use it over and over again, right? Because it's very simple. Like you can censor like any effort for citizens to call out the government in this particular circumstance can be silenced, because any effort that you take to say, hey, my government is acting not in my favor will be deemed a Western thing, and you as an individual rising up and fighting for your freedom can also be deemed a Western thing, which is why the amount of opposition to this kind of abuse will be extremely less at the point in which governments are given this leverage, given how broad the term Western values could necessarily be. And lastly, right, it now becomes a part of your, like, oh yeah, move on. Sorry.
Are you saying that banning movies makes people blind to corruption and like downright bad use of funds?
No, see, look, the obvious thing here is that the Western values in and of itself is an extremely broad term. So the point in which governments censor that, and like it covers literally every aspect of life and things like that, right? People fighting for freedom or questioning the government on like restricting their needs could be deemed something as a Western propaganda, and that's why governments could easily use that as a way to shut down individuals on ground, individuals whose voices are extremely important, right? But secondly, I'm going to talk about how this impacts local cultures, right? So OG said that this limiting these things will make us move on to local culture and we'll appreciate local culture more, right? This is absolute bullshit. The point in which you limit something, it becomes really sexy. Like for example, the kinds of movies that reach certain parts of China from Hollywood are extremely less. But Hollywood actually has a really big market there, because even if these movies are little, the amount of people who actually show up to see them is huge, right? The point in time you restrict something, you make it look really amazing for a few structural reasons. Firstly, it's not accessible to many individuals, but you've obviously heard some stories about it, right? And given that your countries were colonized at some point in time, obviously the narrative of the white men being superior still exists. So obviously that these white movies will also be perceived as something which is superior. So even if they come in smaller numbers in your quota, so on and so forth, the amount of people that will go to watch them are tremendous. It's very easy for someone to leave a local busking group to see Muse when they come visit, because you've heard of them, right? They're fucking amazing, but like your government will only allow them to enter like once a year or once in like 5 years, right? But the second thing, CG talked about a quota and like how big companies will change, right? And these movies will be more accommodating to local culture. I think this is nonsense, right? Because the movies that will come here firstly are subjugated to heavy censorship. So for example, China will only allow the kinds of movies that don't say anything about the Chinese government. Also in Iran, they allow Hollywood movies to come under Persian dialogues and things like that, right? Which literally change the meaning of the film entirely, as it has when they allowed Batman to reach Iran, right? And that was an extremely problematic thing, as it has nothing to do that was against the government, and the government will only allow these movies to come that are not a threat. But secondly, how the culture has more value in this particular circumstance, right? Firstly, your culture is not seen as something that comes at the expense of all the fun things, right? That in and of itself, I think, will definitely convince most people in their youth. But secondly, people can take ownership over their own culture. Like obviously, these people have anti-colonial rhetorics within their countries, right? So they're not necessarily just going to jump into Western culture. But Western culture in this particular circumstance allows your local culture to improve. Sure, there's the element of competition that would force your local cultures to improve. But secondly, the fact that your local cultures can now learn specific things from these cultures and improve is an extremely important thing. We saw this with India. We literally saw how Bollywood movies have changed over time to be more accommodating of different levels of freedom, which only came as a result of Hollywood having an active market within India. So obviously these specific things that you can learn as a result of somebody else's culture is extremely important. And this is the only way in which India and many other countries can have a culture which is more accepting to freedom and things like that. Ladies and gentlemen, we're the only team that protects culture in a way which it can evolve and be more accommodating. Proud.
Thank you very much for being trying to qualify for the government.
In my speech, I'll do three things. I'll first deal with the argumentations coming from closing opposition. Second, I'll talk about choice and argumentation that was brought up in opening, also borrowed in closing. And thirdly, I'll talk about this idea of standards and on which side do we get better achievement of a greater standard both teams. First, closing opposition. I think closing opposition talks essentially about three things. First is this idea of anti-colonial rhetorics and how is it that our proposal just further exacerbates this. We would like to posit to you when it comes to anti-colonial rhetorics, especially in the context of post-colonial countries, it's something that's very much important is to the protection of the nascent state of these situations. For example, I'll give you two situations. If you talk about sentiments on the ground, after a post-conflict and etc., you need to skew certain sentiments on the ground is for you to create a greater good in terms of benefit that comes to everyone. For example, post-Rwanda, there had to be active action by the state to limit the narratives that were set by the general that went persecuting the minorities of Hutus. This was done, albeit there was some level of skewing in a post-conflict situation. It was important for you to regulate the sentiments on the ground for a greater good. Similarly, when it comes to economic things, right? For example, Korea and Japan, right? We actively restrict the bringing in of cars, imported cars, supposed to push forward the development of Honda and Hyundai, right? Because these were important things for you to push towards a dominant narrative that already exists, for you to push towards greater involvement and protection policies of your local cultures and local situations. Similarly to this proposal, right? Entirety of government bench has already showed you the problem that comes with regards to post-colonial countries and the dominant standards and narratives that's already set, which is why we think it's perfectly justified for us to do this, given the two precedents that I've showed. But the second argumentation that closing opposition brings is that this is going to be used as governments as a scapegoat, when they push away things and etc. Two responses to this. We think things like political censorship is something that will happen on both sides, right? If your state if a Western a movie is going to put forward a movie that is extremely harmful towards your state. Countries like Indonesia, countries like Malaysia, even in status quo, already restrict this to begin with. We don't think that's a fair burden to push to our side that it's exclusive harm. But second, we think it is perfectly fine and individuals, as a matter of fact, push forward the differentiation for you to recognize that some harms may have accrued from your colonizers, but also other harms that are exacerbated by individual politicians on the ground, people smuggling money, putting to their own account, right? You have your 1MDB scandal in Malaysia. We didn't always blame the colonizers, look, they took our money. No, these are your own people that take the money. We don't think it is as minuscule for you to diminish people's capacity to that extent. But what we harm then if you choose to trade off the effects of your post-colonizers? Because look, post-colonizers also affected to the extent in which your country has today. So it doesn't mean you just trade off that because you don't want people to be distracted, right? For example, the LGBT community, it is a true fact that they are a lot more regressive now because of the fact that they were not treated as equal. They were actively persecuted at back in time, that they don't have prominent figures in the country. Similarly, like for example, when they lobbied against Canada, Justin Trudeau gave them reparations and acknowledged, right, that the harm that we have posited. These type of reparations and recognitions are important, and we cannot trade it off just because it could potentially distract people when we don't think that's an exclusive argument to begin with. Please sit down. The third argument, and this is the funniest, they say when you restrict something, it becomes sexy and then your problem doesn't get solved. Yeah, maybe it becomes sexy, but the 2 Western movies you watch in a year is overweight by the 50 other local films that you watch in a year. Even if it's one that is sexy, the discussion, the discourse that you have with your friends, the movie that is most fresh in your memory is the local movies that would exist. So even if it's not about whether it's sexy or it's not, it's about the dominant narrative that you now twist and turn as opposed to the Western agenda towards a more local agenda, right? So we think these are the reasons in which that closing opposition doesn't stand in this debate. But also note, they were not responsive at all to the extensions that Leroy talked to you about, something I'll talk about right now. Please sit down. Let's talk about the idea of choice, because essentially, opening up and closing up say choice is important. Yeah, fine, choice is important. But it's not as simple as you giving 2 options and then you have a choice. Right now, it's a Hobson choice. Why? Because although you have 2 options, one option is something that is created in a Western country, has a lot more money pushed into it, and a lot of people are accessing towards it. There's a dominant narrative that skews the ability of individuals to make an informed choice as to which is it that they should choose. See, like for example, right? If your end goal is self-actualization, you need to tilt the balance that exists, something that can only be done through our proposal, because they also recognize that there is a dominant narrative as to how is it that Western movies are portrayed and looked at as opposed to local movies. So if choice is what they really want, and they want individuals to make their self-actualized choice, similar to what we have, but the asymmetry of power is something they have to recognize, and it's only our proposal that limits that. Because look, we only limit, we don't completely ban, right? And this is a unique extension that Leroy talked about as to the leverage that we can do. The moment you limit, right, and you tell that you have to include all of these aspects into your movies for it to be accepted into our local scenes, that's when you can push for more local celebrities, local cultures, local anything, history, right, being put into your movies for it to be positive also. So even if closing up says the movie become more sexy, under our side you have that sexiness, and you also have the pushing towards your local situations as compared to an absolute lack of it on side opposition, because you can never have that leverage on your side when you don't have anything hold against them. The success stories of how China has pushed towards this, and all the examples Leroy talked about, was never once engaged by closing opposition, and this is a benefit that we can get. Let's talk about the third thing before I go on here.
A lot of post-colonial states have disproportionate power to create nationalist and anti-West rhetoric, because these are the things that fuel the movement, ensure the successes, allow post-colonialism to happen, and they can do this through many other means like curriculum, mandatory education, military building.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay, so all these alternatives that you want to talk about, I don't know why it's one mutually exclusive to our side. But more importantly, especially in the context of a film industry, what I think is very important, one is highly accessible. People can, and it engages the interest of people a lot more than reading a book and to watching a movie. But if they want to achieve all the benefit we want through their movies, they never once engage Leroy's extension also as to why is it not mutually exclusive. The fact that you have got a Western movie and a local movie, one that already has the dominant narrative that existed, also the fact that you have got a lot more money, a lot more lobbying power, a lot more advertisement power, and that can't, and the local movie can't compete with that, which is why we need to tilt that power asymmetry. If they want to push the benefit of our side through the same proposal, it cannot be done in status quo, and that is something that neither side has responded to. Let's talk about standards, right? Positive standards. Note that as much as the government bench has said that these movies can give negative standards, all opposition did is that they can also provide positive standards. I think this is a deadlock. But to the extent that we will pose it to you, that we also will give you analysis as to why local industry can also push forward the same narrative. This is an extension from opening, right? Think like in India, you have movies like Kapoor and Son that push towards gay narrative. The movie like India's Daughter, right? Something that push towards the position of women within these industries. This shows that our industries are also capable of transitioning, and we think it's better accepted towards these local communities when it comes directly to these things. If they want to push for organic change in opening up, organic change can also be done on our side. I don't know why it's a mutually exclusive argument that they would push for. Panel, in this debate, we think movies do have a significant power, and we think we need to tilt the power asymmetry that exists towards our side, and that's why we're proud to propose.
Thank you very much. That's been tried to call on the line of speaker.
The reason why the Bangladeshi people value their language so much is because people fought and died for their language. So this is the same thing that applies for culture. If it is just there and you see people dancing all the time, you have your elders telling stories, you probably as a person who is growing up wouldn't value your culture as much. But when you have a cultural war where you're fighting against the colonialist powers and their imperialism and their whitewashing of your movies and your culture, we think this is a point in time which you value your culture to a greater extent. That was the extension that was coming from IDSA that we know failed to acknowledge. We think that the point in time which you have the point in time which you take ownership of your culture, and the point in time which you realize your culture is something that is very significant, is the point in time which you have long-term progression and long-term sustainability and valuing of your culture. This doesn't happen on their side when the culture just exists. People will still think that your culture will be there for a long time. So that kind of existence of a cultural, that kind of existence of a war between two cultures, between the white colonialists and between your country, means that the kind of emphasis you put will be much greater. This means your parents will put a greater emphasis on making sure that you pass on the dances, on your language, your literature to a greater extent to compare to their side, where they just feel like your culture will exist. We think this happens to a greater extent on our side, the point in time which you feel like you need to take ownership, the point in time which you local artists feel that they have a need to protect their own language and protect their own culture. So we think the point in time we should value these things will exist much better under our side. Second thing I'll talk about is the quota system that both OG and C wanted to talk about. Two reasons why the quota system is bad. They said it has been great in China without giving any examples. I'll give you two examples. I don't know which Chinese character existed in Transformers. That was one of the movies that they allowed. Great Wall was about China, but had Matt Damon as the lead actor. I don't know how that Chinese government is making sure that the Chinese values or Chinese actors are going there. We don't think Chinese governments or governments of these countries have an incentive to make sure that they include local artists or local values. We think the main incentive of these governments is to make sure that their censorship laws and the kind of power they have over the people is maintained. I think the main incentive for these people through media or through movies is to propagate their own governmental values. So we don't think that would necessarily happen the way they want. Second thing that I want to say in this regard is the point regarding subsidy. We think this will only work, or this works only in big countries, probably like China or India. This is not an argument that would apply to the rest of the developing world, which was also colonized. We don't think this method would lead to improvement of culture in smaller countries like Maldives or Sri Lanka. We think the way you can improve or like have better like appreciation of culture in these smaller countries where this debate largely happens. It's not China, just China and India. We think the improvement happens the point in time which you value the culture the way we want, but the point in time which you can incorporate the kind of teachings that all talked about. These are the point in time which you are able to improve. Third thing we said was the premium you place on the values is so much higher. The point in time which you have like 4 or 5 movies coming each year, everyone will go and try to get into these movies. The price of these movies will be much greater. We think this also sends a message to everyone within the country that the premium you place on their culture is greater. Like white movies are so expensive. We think people will also feel like white culture is better than the Chinese culture or Indian culture. So we think you subjugate your own culture to a secondary level. You might have 15 or 20 or 100 movies that will be released, but your appreciation for your culture and the value you place on your local artists will be much lesser. You'll be willing to pay $50 and go and watch Transformers, but if a local artist demands in Malaysia to pay $50 to go and watch a movie, like what the fuck, you have like 15 movies coming out every year, you will not be paying these things. We think the value you place on your culture is much lesser under their side compared to this. We think the cost this comes at the end of the day, even if they're able to achieve all these things, is the cost that you have in regarding to things like censorship and the involvement of culture that was coming from IDSA that they didn't engage with. Sure.
Okay. OG told you subscription in art is oftentimes based on promotion, which Western bases have a lot more money to invest in. How do you ever able to counteract this?
We think they have been able to counteract these things in a lot of countries. Like you can see in India, Bollywood is largely, even though you have a lot of Western movies coming in, when you appreciate your own culture, when you feel like your own culture is also something that is valuable, people go and watch Bollywood movies. The reason why they do this is that because they don't see white movies as being something that is much better. They feel like they are musicals of having like 8 songs is a great way of entertainment compared to the Western way of entertainment. We think the point in time which you value your culture, you will be willing to give that money. That happens in India, the point in time which you have that cultural war. When you have white movies and Bollywood movies coming in, this is a point in time they feel like they can make an active choice and go into that Bollywood movie compared to China, where had just 7 white movies and you like place a higher premium on these kind of things. Going to the second extension that was brought regarding censorship laws and why these things are inherently bad. We told you that the kind of long-term harms that we'll have in your country is great because of the kind of influence that media and art has. This allows the government to control the narrative and government to implicitly pass on a lot of messages to the masses, right? So the response that was coming from like Vinod was great. So he said that you needed to do these things in countries like Rwanda. Exactly the reason why people like Paul Kagame has been able to be in power for 30 years, because they're able to control the media and censorship laws to like paint everything that is against his rule as white, everything that is against him as colonial imperialism. So these are the kind of things that governments of countries like China has also been using. This also means the kind of local artists that you wanted to talk about will also not be able to prosper. I forgot the name. The guy who won the like Nobel Prize for Literature in China, who was jailed. This guy was also not able to talk about his things or be a local artist or promote his work because of the kind of censorship laws. He was also labeled as someone who is bringing in white imperialism and democracy and things like that. So these are also things that wouldn't necessarily happen. This also means if they want to bring progressive values under their side, this is also something that wouldn't happen. The point in time which they organically improve or whatever happens, some local artists want to talk about gay rights or whatever else they want to talk about democracy. That person will also be painted as a person who is bringing white ideas or colonialist ideologies. That person will also be censored. This means the kind of evolvement of culture that will happen under side wouldn't happen. The kind of things or the perception regarding love marriage that happened in India wouldn't have happened without the influence of Hollywood movies or the books that tell the Indian population that you can fall in love and get married. You don't have to go and have a dowry marriage. These are things, kind of values that were brought into these countries through Western movies. People have the ability to choose whether their culture should evolve or whether you should stick to your culture. We think the point in time which you can choose whether you want to be in your culture or not is the point in time which you appreciate your culture more, and it allows your country to evolve to a much better level, and you don't have the government censoring and making sure your people are subjugated for a long time. Free of course.
Thank you. Thanks.